In 1933, something wholly alien began spreading across the Earth. Outgrowths of a strange and deadly ecosystem threatened mankind's extinction, but this was merely the prelude to something far more terrifying. From deep within the altered territories of the planet came strange lights and eventually towering machines. This new enemy was given a name, the Synfaxi, and for years every army sent against them simply burned away, and only atomic detonations and a single great united effort saved humanity from being entirely consumed. In the aftermath of the First Synfaxi War, a strange type of armistice had been achieved, but the end of the Earth was inevitable. Though the rapid spread of the outgrowths had been stopped, every year their boundaries still expanded just a little further. And the United Front, meanwhile, the desperate alliance that had saved mankind, was betrayed and collapsed. Alliances, rivalries, and all the petty politics returned, even in the face of this new outside element that threatened all humanity. As every attempt to restore the planet's fading climate failed, the world's great powers increasingly looked to the stars. Armed with technologies and insights acquired during the war against the Synfaxi, they found a great new frontier not only within reach but seemingly brimming with worlds awaiting colonization. As the Earth continued to deteriorate and the spread of the outgrowths again accelerated, the colonization effort slowly turned into an evacuation. Finally, the Earth was subjected to a nuclear bombardment, denying it to both the Synfaxi and humanity, which now lay scattered across hundreds of star systems. Not every colony survived the miniature Dark Age that followed, and new nations and governments were formed in its aftermath. But as communications and interstellar travel were restored, a new balance of power began to assert itself across what humanity labeled the Orion Arm. Swept up in an ideological fervor, the most powerful nations began competing with one another for influence and wealth, igniting a Cold War that would define the Orion Arm for generations. It is now the penultimate decade of the 23rd century. Many believe that this vast ideological struggle has escalated beyond any hope of reconciliation, and a direct war between the superpowers is inescapable. Aggressive military buildups, multifaceted diplomacy, economic warfare, proxy conflicts, all are being waged now, not in the hope of peace, but in the relentless pursuit of any advantage, no matter how small, that might decide the fate of the Orion Arm and humanity itself. But on the edge of the frontier have come strange accounts and troubling rumors, stories that put into question one of the most important assumptions that humanity has chosen to embrace, that the Synfaxi, whatever they were, are merely a memory. That's the basic premise of Dawn of Victory, a world-building project that the Templin Institute is going to be developing into a rich and hopefully interesting setting, or expanded universe if you prefer. I want to make a vast space opera combined with military science fiction, some alternate history, and Lovecraftian horror thrown in for good measure. There should be dynamic geopolitics, mingling with competing ideologies, and space battles, and questions over the morality of violence or the justification of sovereignty. It should be an expansive universe that also feels deep, suitable for anything from a tabletop role-playing session to an entire cinematic universe if Netflix runs out of ideas. That's the goal anyways, and over the course of this series, we'll be building this setting right out in the open here on YouTube. If you're interested in how that process is going to work, I'd encourage you to check out our Way of World Building playlist. The first video in that series covers the basic format we'll be following here. The cliff notes, though, are that for every following video in this series, the world-building aspects of the process will be discussed here on the Templin Institute, while anything specific to the Dawn of Victory setting will be happening on a separate channel, just so we're not bombarding people with updates on this project who may not be interested. But we are still very much at the start of this process, and in this video, I want to provide a pretty comprehensive overview of the central pillars of Dawn of Victory, the unique core elements that will define this setting, and the themes and inspirations behind them. There's a lot to cover. If we were creating a TV show, game, or movie, this sort of reference document might sometimes be described as a series Bible. But because I technically wrote this script in a cabin in the woods, we get downgraded on a technicality to rambling manifesto? Aw, come on. Well, it took nearly a month of complete isolation, but I'm proud to say that I finally figured out my opening line. What do you think of the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race? But rambling manifesto might be accurate because I love these genres and all the elements within them, and getting the chance to develop my own setting the way I feel it should be done is a dream. I have so many thoughts about all this stuff that just trying to explain it all is a nightmare. So what I've tried to do is distill all my opinions down into a few central tenets, pillars that I can use to inform everything from the tone to the aesthetics of this universe. And in this video, I'm going to discuss each one, why I think they're important, highlight some other settings that handled it particularly well or maybe missed the mark, and then explain how that same element will work in Dawn of Victory. After that, we have a whole ton of announcements regarding the first bit of lore, artwork, and a custom wiki for this universe, so grab yourself a bottle of genuine Atzlan Vanilla Coke and some Leningrad-style Stroganoff and settle in, because this is a long one. Or, skip around, watch it at your own pace, I'm not gonna fault you for it. But before we can delve too deep into any of those unique pillars I want to talk about, I first need to make sure everyone is acquainted with the concept of the Standard Sci Fi Setting. During my introduction, I described Dawn of Victory as being a blend of a few genres, but mostly sci-fi. And I'm not trying to drastically redefine or reinvent that genre or any other. I'm not going to pretend I'm operating on the same level as Tolkien or Frank Herbert, so I'm going to stay in my lane. What I'm trying to create instead is something iterative rather than revolutionary, my version of what is sometimes called the Standard Sci Fi Setting. If you haven't heard this term before, you'll find a link in the description to TV Tropes, which has an article covering all the various elements common to this general premise. A wide range of universes fall under the Standard Sci Fi Setting umbrella, but generally, if there's interstellar empires, space battles, and some alien civilizations, it probably qualifies. I am an absolutely shameless fan of the Standard Sci Fi Setting. I love them when they're done well, and I love making videos picking them apart when I feel things have been handled poorly. As a genre, what can I say? It just speaks to me. But Standard Sci Fi Setting is still a pretty broad classification, so let's narrow it down a bit further. Dawn of Victory lies on the darker, more gritty and realistic end of the sci-fi setting spectrum. Not necessarily in how technology functions or anything to do with the fundamental nature of the universe, but rather in just presenting outer space as yet another environment in which people will live, work, and bring their problems. Interstellar travel might be routine, humanity might have spread across hundreds of worlds, but this is not a utopia. You're still gonna get slammed in your taxes, your company doesn't pay you enough, and if you do manage to get an assignment in space, it's probably going to be doing something nobody else wants to do. For most people, life's challenges remain. The universe of Alien almost invented this subgenre in the modern sense, and there is no way I can get away with claiming it's not a major inspiration. I think some other good examples, though, are the settings of Blade Runner, Battlestar Galactica, Killzone, Event Horizon, with maybe something like Mass Effect and Halo right around the cutoff point. What all these have in common, and what I want to bring to Dawn of Victory, is just that heightened sense of plausibility from a modern perspective. A universe like Star Trek might very well prove to be a more realistic vision of the future, I certainly hope so, but right now at least, settings like Alien just feel more realistic. The crew of the Nostromo was not some evolved version of humanity with superior morals and intellect cruising through the galaxy with technology bordering on magic. They were regular people, every bit as flawed and nuanced as we are now, with problems and gripes that feel very familiar. Your mileage might vary, of course, but to me, this just feels like the kind of interstellar society that we're heading towards. And that comparison alone is probably enough to give you a general vague sense of the tone I'm going for. But a general sci-fi setting is defined by a ton of other elements, and saying it's kinda like Alien only gets us so far, so let's quickly cover some of the major elements of the standard sci-fi setting and how they'll work in DOV. These are all things we'll be covering in more detail down the line, so I hope you can forgive the rapid-fire version presented here. First, the time period. There's a few different eras that I want to explore, starting in 1933, but the current year of Dawn of Victory is somewhere around 2285. On the hard-soft axis of science fiction, it's somewhere in the middle. It doesn't take place in some distant galaxy with parallel versions of humans, but represents the future of our own world, or more accurately, the future of an alternate history. Although that sounds pretentious, so let's work on a better way to phrase that. And because of that bit of alternate history, the major spacefaring powers, the major factions of this universe, include both nations we'd recognize from our modern world, nations that collapse at some point in our history but live on in this one, and new nations that have emerged on distant stars without any direct predecessor here on Earth. Humanity has explored and colonized about 1,000 different star systems across a wide area of space, but this territory only represents a minuscule fragment of the total galaxy. Collectively, it's known as the Orion Arm. Technology has progressed, but unevenly. Humanity possesses an advanced interstellar society, but outside of faster-than-light travel, there has been no massive technological singularity that has fundamentally shifted the nature of civilization. Interstellar travel is routine, but not common for most people, akin to international travel in our own world. And while I don't have a name for my version of warp drive yet, it's essentially hyperlanes from something like Stellaris or Star Wars, but then made a bit more complicated. Travel time isn't entirely based on distance, so while you might be able to cross a huge section of the Orion Arm in, say, just a few months, certain regions might take years to pass through. Aliens exist. The Synfaxi pretty much definitively proved the existence of extraterrestrial life, even if some people are still convinced they were in fact agents of the devil. That said though, while a wealth of ruins have been found across the Orion Arm, some absolutely immense, direct contact has not been established with any alien race, but it's gotta be a question of when, not if, right? There is nothing supernatural. Probably. And finally, the main conflict at the heart of the setting is an immense ideological Cold War between 5 major political blocs, one that will decide the future of the human race. So if that's the basic foundation we're building off of, what's going to make Dawn of Victory unique? At the top of my list is geopolitics, the relationship between different nations, and the way it's expressed through diplomacy, war, economics, technology, or the multitude of other ways in which sovereign states interact with each other. This is probably not that surprising if you're a regular viewer of the Templin Institute. I love investigating the nations, factions, and organizations of alternate worlds so much, I accidentally made a career out of it. But in our world, these political dynamics are complex, messy, and nuanced, exactly the kind of thing that doesn't exactly lend itself too well to more straightforward narratives. And for this reason, I think in a lot of fictional settings we see geopolitical elements dumbed down or stripped of a lot of the complexity that makes them interesting in the first place. Within the standard sci-fi setting, geopolitics generally looks like this. You have the possibly flawed but ultimately well-meaning Federation confronted by the martial and maybe not entirely evil Empire. There might be some minor third faction consisting of rebels or mercenaries, while beyond known space, some darker, greater threat looms ominously. You can see variations of this dynamic in everything from Star Wars, Halo, Killzone, Starfield, The Expanse, Firefly, and many others. There are some exceptions to this. Star Trek, Stargate, Mass Effect, Destiny, and Babylon 5 all include a greater variety of factions that aren't so easily placed into these narrow categories, and correspondingly, the types of geopolitical stories they can tell become much more complex. But even then, you rarely see more than a dozen galactic powers with lasting relevance. And this can be enough for some interesting geopolitics. The dynamics of the various civilizations in Star Trek are a personal favorite of mine, but even in a setting like Mass Effect, where a large part of the universe is built on the relationship between the members of the Citadel Council and geopolitics are a major element, they can still feel rather simple when compared to that of our own multifaceted modern world. Which, to be clear, isn't always some big problem that needs to be fixed. I've talked before about why I think certain settings might benefit from more complex geopolitics, but something like Firefly or Killzone doesn't automatically become better just because you add a bunch more nations or factions or whatever. In the case of Dawn of Victory though, because geopolitics are going to be at the forefront, I really want to try and replicate the intricate dynamics we see in our own world. Which might be a tall order. Over the last few centuries, there have been between 50 to 100 sovereign states at any one time, spiking to nearly 200 after the various decolonization movements of the 20th century. Combined with internal factions, international organizations, multinational corporations, and hundreds of other types of non-state actors, the world is a complex place. And while it would be insane to think we could replicate this level of sophistication and detail in a fictional world, I think there's a satisfying middle ground. A Song of Ice and Fire might be the absolute best example of this. In each of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros alone, you have a multitude of great houses, royal titles, cadet branches, lordly houses, knightly houses, and many others, all of which have their own agendas and rivalries, both internal and external. Strange Real from Ace Combat is another great example. This is a world designed to accommodate geopolitical conflict. It lacks the same detail as A Song of Ice and Fire, but this ends up being a good thing. Whenever a new game is being developed, you can pick 2 countries on the map that are going to war, and from there, build out their relationship over the course of the story, and slowly but surely fill out the entire world. And lastly, we have a personal favorite of mine, the world of the Kaiserreich. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this alternate history is every bit as detailed as Westeros or Essos, and like Strange Real, it's been specifically designed to support any number of geopolitical conflicts. It's this deeply engaging sandbox that can end in any number of wildly different outcomes. So with Geopolitics and Dawn of Victory, or Astropolitics if you prefer, the setting needs to feature extreme complexity, create the conditions for numerous conflicts and rivalries, and function as a kind of sandbox. This is giving me a headache just thinking about it, so what it also needs is a sort of framework, something to give this mess structure. And for that, we need to look to the Cold War. From a geopolitical perspective, the Cold War has got to be one of the most interesting eras in human history. It was a time in which the strategies and tensions of the conflict assumed a dominant role on the global stage. The entire planet became this massive chessboard, with each side making these immensely complex moves, some obvious, some subtle, all to advance their interests and ideology. Entire countries were turned into playing pieces or prizes to be won, and all of it was done with the expectation that World War III might be inevitable. And in that case, if the stakes are that high, then every advantage, no matter how small, has to be pursued. In Dawn of Victory, that's the dynamic I want to try to replicate, and then dial it up to 11. And the main way we'll achieve this is by making our Cold War in the Orion Arm not a geopolitical struggle between two groups, but between 5. We take the multipolar world that existed prior to the 30 Years' War, World War I, or World War II, when you had multiple great powers in their prime, and combine that with the rivalry, sophistication, and scope of the Cold War. Right away, I think this multipolar universe leads to some interesting geopolitical scenarios, because how do you conquer the chessboard when there's 4 other players trying to do the exact same thing? Do you start a proxy war against rival superpower B in Territory 1, while at the same time secretly supporting superpower B in Territory 2, because they're competing with superpower C, who you also want to see lose? It's a dynamic that invites shifting alliances, flexible morals, subtle manipulations, and at times, direct confrontation. And because we have this overarching framework to operate within, we can take all the different conflicts that you typically see in science fiction or space operas and give them this new Cold War context. I love a good interstellar war as much as the next guy, but so often they happen in complete isolation. The UNSC versus the Covenant, the Helghast versus the ISA, the Rebel Alliance versus the Galactic Empire. In Dawn of Victory, conflicts like this exist, but they both impact and are affected by other conflicts and other events in the wider galaxy. There are Cold Wars within Cold Wars, proxy wars within proxy wars. In a straightforward story of good versus evil, these shades of gray aren't really appropriate, but in Dawn of Victory, they're the point. But having a ton of different factions and alliances and power blocks only gets us so far. To make the geopolitical relationship between them interesting, our factions need to be distinct. They need to have different values and outlooks and goals. They need to have some reason as to why they want to confront each other in the first place. There are a multitude of ways to achieve this. Resource scarcity is a big one. But ultimately, what I find most interesting as a driver of geopolitical conflict is ideology, the second pillar of Dawn of Victory. Now, ever since Red Alert got its hooks in me, I have been fascinated by the concept of the ideological state. Those nations organized around a core set of beliefs that dictate everything from their domestic policies and social structure to its role and actions in international affairs.
Our enemies are all around us. We must always be on our guard. Sure, we'll lose a lot of snooze time, but that's okay. We'll catch up after the revolution's over.
That's enough, Tom.
And like any child exposed to the teachings of Karl Marx, I had only the basic grasp of what capitalism was, but I knew it had to be destroyed. Communism, by contrast, with its ability to fire paratrooping war bears out of flak cannons, seemed like the obvious solution for all of mankind's problems. Now, it turns out the games of the Red Alert series didn't quite capture the nuances of either ideology, and thank God my views have evolved significantly since then. But so has my fascination with this topic, and I very much doubt I'm alone on this. Successful examples of the ideological state, if you want to call them that, have this remarkable ability to tap into our collective psyche. In their media, their propaganda, the image of themselves they put out to the world, well, I'm no psychologist, but it activates something powerful in our primal caveman lizard brains. There's a reason why science fiction and fantasy so often evoke the aesthetics of the ideological states. It's because they work. But it's not just the aesthetics. From a narrative standpoint, ideology heightens the stakes and outcome of any conflict, because each side isn't trying to seize a piece of territory or secure some strategic resource. It's bigger than that. They're trying to create a new world, one incompatible with any other. Please forgive me, I can't remember the author, but I once saw ideological conflict described as a war for the human soul, which I thought was rather accurate and profound. And when the stakes are that high, almost nothing is off the table. Ideology is just this natural dramatic element. That's kind of what makes it meaningful in the first place. Let's use Halo as an example. From a purely rational standpoint, there was no reason why there should have been any conflict between the UNSC and the Covenant. Both sides had plenty of space, plenty of resources, and even if they disagreed on certain issues, a long protracted war of annihilation was against their mutual interests. But because the Covenant religious ideology was so directly threatened by the mere existence of humanity, all of a sudden both sides have been forced into a war of extinction. There can be no negotiation, no half measures, no way out. By the end of that conflict, one side could no longer exist. That to me is extremely interesting. Compare that with the Dance of Dragons. Each branch of the Targaryen dynasty fundamentally believes the exact same thing, they just disagree on who gets to sit on the throne. Sure, certain policies might change, some houses might be favored over others, but regardless of which side wins, the political situation in Westeros is going to be largely the same. I think to some extent, this makes the Dance of Dragons a less interesting conflict, at least from an ideological, geopolitical stance. But what I think a lot of popular science fiction overlooks is that ideology is not only a means of setting up conflict or moving a story along, it's a powerful force in people's lives. And it's at its most interesting when it's credible, when it's so compelling that I can absolutely believe that someone would dedicate themselves to this. And this is where we run into a problem. I am not smart enough to invent some new ideologies that can plausibly turn the wheels of geopolitics and inspire masses of zealots. For both this reason, and because they're so critical to the setting, I think it's important that the ideologies in Dawn of Victory are not some made-up space ideologies, but real ones, specifically capitalism, communism, fascism, imperialism, militarism, and all the other isms.
Yikes. Well, good luck with all that.
And yeah, I get it. This is a complicated subject, and I'm not looking to offend anybody. But as someone fascinated with ideology, I don't like how in a lot of standard sci-fi settings, especially in futuristic portrayals of our own world, it's treated as this problem that needs to be solved. So often, the future history of Earth features World War III or some other calamity that conveniently erases the modern global order and all of its touchy subjects. In its place, we usually get some boring, vaguely Western world government with a variation of free market capitalism that nobody ever talks about, lest we upset foreign markets. And when these ideologies do still exist, they're usually given different names. In Halo, communists become Clausewics, fascists become Frieden. In Alien, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has become the Union of Progressive Peoples. While in Killzone, Nazi Germany is back, only now they call themselves the Helghast Empire. I got no problem with this. I really appreciate when fictional worlds draw inspiration from these real-life sources. I'm a strong proponent of this in world building in general. But I think in some cases there is a danger that it's beginning to affect how mass audiences approach these topics. By changing the names and the logos, these complex ideologies become more palatable to us, and as a consequence, I think we're less critical of them. I run a YouTube channel, so I am under no illusion that my findings are not going to be biased here, but one of the first big surprises I encountered after starting the Templin Institute was how often discussions about fictional ideological states, the Helghast or Galactic Empire for example, began to feature a lot of the warped interpretations of real-life ideologies, history and geopolitics that we see again and again. And I hate to admit it, but a decade or so ago, that might have been me leaving those comments. Ideology is a captivating topic and it bleeds into history and geopolitics in really nuanced ways. It's fun to feel knowledgeable about all this stuff and take part in the discussions, but they're also complex and messy, and it's so easy for even well-intentioned people to inadvertently develop these biases. There are some great examples here on YouTube of videos debunking the public image most dictatorships present, from their upper leadership and structure down to more granular stuff like the myth of German tank superiority in World War II. And I think these videos are so popular because the stuff they're debunking has become so pervasive. The propaganda of these regimes still works, and that can be scary. And while I don't think popular culture is really to blame for all this, I'm not sure it's doing much to fix it either. I mentioned earlier that science fiction loves borrowing the aesthetics of the ideological state, but I think in doing so, they can begin to take the propaganda of these regimes at face value. Star Trek Picard became the latest example of this in its portrayal of the Confederation of Earth. In this alternate reality, the idea that fascism provides order, security, and is better at defending the state is just accepted and not challenged in the slightest within the narrative. And in Star Wars Ahsoka, the Templin Institute just recently put out a video discussing how in trying to create the kind of pulp adventures the franchise is known for, it may have inadvertently had one of its heroes defame the principles of democracy. And while examples like this aren't that big a deal, I do think they illustrate the danger of incorporating elements of ideology into a narrative without trying to understand them. I certainly don't want to position myself as some sort of expert who has this all figured out, and I am not fully convinced this is the best way to tackle this subject. But if we're going to address ideology so prominently in this setting, I think we have to do it honestly, and part of that means not hiding them behind different names and not buying into the propaganda or the stereotypes. Dawn of Victory is a universe where the competition between ideologies that dominated the 1920s, 1930s, and 40s never ended. The German Reich, the Soviet Union, the Empire of Japan, these nations still exist. To survive into the 23rd century, they have needed to adapt and change, and in some cases, abandon some of the most firmly held beliefs, but the core philosophy remains. It is a universe where, just like in certain periods of our own history, the triumph of Western democracy is not guaranteed. And I think that's a very relevant fear right now. Growing up in the 90s, I remember thinking that ideology as a concept was almost archaic. Capitalism and democracy had won because they were the best system, full stop. And the idea that democracy needed to be defended against a communist dictatorship, for example, was absurd and played for laughs.
It's a bouncing baby boy, yet another soldier in the fight against communism.
But something I think my generation has had to come to terms with is that many of these concepts and conflicts are not as archaic as we'd like. Authoritarianism, militarism, imperialism, even fascism. These are not going anywhere, and in many ways, economic and political ideologies are just as relevant today as they were during the Cold War, or the 1930s for that matter. On TikTok, you can find Gen Z passionately discussing the idea of late-stage capitalism or the merits of socialism, and I am absolutely convinced that if mankind achieves an interstellar civilization, these conversations, or others like them, will still be going on. Whether we like it or not, ideology is something we'll be taking into space. I mean, it's what brought us there in the first place. Now, obviously, there is a very fine line to walk here, and plenty of ways to handle this indelicately. We need to show shades of gray without suggesting moral equivalency. We need to reconcile the fact that while brutal regimes are often capable of achieving great things, it is usually in spite of their brutality and not because of it. And while I don't think it's really appropriate or necessary for a project like this to focus on the worst atrocities of these kind of regimes, we also can't pretend they're not capable of them. And we have to do that while creating a universe that, would still be pretty fun to run a role-playing campaign in. This is a tall order, I know, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be the guy that figures it all out, but this is the stuff I'm passionate about, so I want to take a crack at it. I'm willing to defend this approach, but I'm not so attached to it that I refuse to listen to feedback, so if you have some, please let me know. If later down the line we decide this needs to change, it will, but for now at least, I hope to some extent this has helped explain why making up fictional philosophies, fictional ideologies, even fictional countries is not an approach I want to take. Not for the important stuff. Now it's about at this point, having just learned that this setting involves the German Reich and Soviet Union fighting in space battles, that you might be thinking, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And yeah, you might have me there. Dawn of Victory is a completely ridiculous premise.
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
But you know what? I kinda like a ridiculous premise, especially in science fiction. The United States Air Force is fighting a secret interstellar war against a race of alien slavers who secretly built the pyramids, and Thor's helping them out? Sounds wild. A planet of giant worms and a drug that lets you see through time? I don't even need to hear about the Bene Gesserit and the Kazawak or whatever, I'm already in. But what I can't stand is when a ridiculous premise lacks faith in itself, anticipates the jokes its critics will make, and then tries to beat them to the punch. It's like the universe is apologizing for its own existence rather than trying to immerse you in it. The most obvious example of this might be the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I'm not going to chase the bandwagon and pretend to always be above these kind of jokes. In the early days, I actually really liked the odd bit of self-referential humor that would slip in.
Okay, look, the city is flying. We're fighting an army of robots. And I have a bow and arrow. None of this makes sense.
But when moments like that become the standard in the MCU or any franchise, I think the entire setting can begin to suffer for it. How bad can the latest supervillain really be when everyone is cracking jokes at their expense? And if the characters aren't taking the events of their world seriously, why should I? So in Dawn of Victory, the ridiculous premise is treated seriously. To our eyes, this universe might seem bizarre, but to the people who live within it, that's their reality and nobody is winking at the camera over it. And in world building, for me at least, I think this can be a scary approach to take. I'm not the most confident writer, and it's nice having the safety net of being able to say, well, that wasn't supposed to be taken seriously. But the settings that really inspire me are the ones that give up that safety net and present themselves as genuinely as they can. But treating the premise seriously doesn't just mean making sure there's no Marvel-style humor. The setting needs to feel consistent and grounded in reality, and that means that we shouldn't be using the more outlandish elements in the setting as a crutch. Something I've noticed with fantasy settings in particular is that sometimes when critics point out plot holes and contrivances, say for example a character being able to instantly cross a river that realistically might have been impassable, some of its defenders will dismiss this criticism outright, saying something like, "The world has fire-breathing dragons and you're worried about a river?" But what I think these people are missing is that it's not the mere presence of fantastical elements like dragons that can break the immersion within a fictional world. It's how they're woven into the rest of that setting. A great setting respects its own rules and is grounded by its own logic. Yes, there are dragons. No, that doesn't make crossing a river easier. Why would it? Of course, actually achieving this level of internal believability is going to take some work. But one of the aspects of that process leads us to our next pillar. If the real world wasn't so boring, we probably wouldn't need to construct alternate ones. Consequently, it's tempting when world building to inject as much action or high-stakes drama as you can. But just as constant self-referential humor can begin to drag down a setting, I think too much excitement can have a similar effect. That probably sounds stupid, so let's look to Halo for an example that illustrates what I mean. The supercarrier Infinity was the biggest, most powerful starship ever built by United Nations Space Command. It was outfitted with all kinds of experimental technology, represented a major technological leap, and symbolically was just incredibly important to a civilization that not that long ago was at risk of becoming extinct. But before it was even commissioned, the Infinity was briefly commandeered by insurrectionists and only retaken after an intense firefight with Spartan super soldiers. As a bit of world building, this just doesn't work for me. The premise already strains credibility, but where it really falls apart is the lack of consequences. If we are supposed to take this universe seriously, then what we're being presented with here should have been an absolutely huge event. Imagine the fallout on our own world if a group of militants briefly took over an American supercarrier, for example. And yet, within the Halo universe, this is just some isolated incident with no repercussions. It doesn't change the nature of the UNSC in any major way, or the insurrectionists, or even escalate the conflict between them. It's just this thing that happened that no one ever talks about again. It's quite literally filler. And when a universe begins to feel like even major actions like this don't always have consequences, then it stops being coherent. There's no cause and effect, it's just a bunch of stuff that's happening. And part of the reason why I think that Halo can't always deal with this stuff seriously, and give it the repercussions it logically would, is that some kind of standard has been set where every piece of lore needs to have some action injected into it to make it interesting. We can't just have the UNSC Infinity be built in a shipyard where nothing goes wrong. It's too important in the setting for that. We need something to happen. And right after that, we need something else to happen, because there can never be a boring moment. So any hope of exploring the repercussions kind of evaporates, there's no time. And now, so much excitement is occurring throughout this universe at all times, it becomes hard to understand how it's all interacting with each other and what the end result actually is. And I don't mean to pick on Halo too much. Every major franchise trying to enforce a single continuity across multiple different storytelling mediums is going to have this same problem. Marvel again has become pretty notorious for this. How many times has the world almost been destroyed only for everyone to just kind of shrug it off? Star Trek has fallen into this too, where every story needs to have galaxy-shattering importance. And we can see in these franchises that the need for a constant stream of action demands that the stakes be escalated more and more to constantly outdo the previous outing. When the Borg first invaded the Federation, they destroyed 39 starships. This most recent time, they had to destroy Stardock, nearly assimilate every ship in the fleet, and millions of Federation citizens. And true to form, 1 year later, Space Dock is back, it's all been rebuilt, and everything's back to normal, because we gotta move on to the next thing. And when it's taken too far, I think you can accidentally turn your whole setting into a cartoon. Back to Halo. The 5th outing in the series opens with a whole team of Spartans jumping out of a Pelican in the upper atmosphere directly into this escalating battle between Covenant starships, narrowly avoiding them as entire cruisers crash into mountains. Then the Spartans start skiing down the mountain, using their jump packs to fly through troop transports while shooting the poor suckers inside, before skiing further down the mountain while avoiding an avalanche of falling debris. I think most Halo fans actually really dug this scene, but to me, the action had become completely cartoonish and over the top. It had drifted away from gritty and grounded military science fiction to become something resembling a comic book movie. This scene would have fit perfectly in the latest Avengers. Compare this to Band of Brothers, something grounded in real history that can't continually escalate its action to superhuman levels in order to keep people interested. Instead, it needs to use its action sparingly or thoughtfully to keep it effective. Band of Brothers succeeds magnificently at this, which is why a scene in which Lieutenant Spears just runs directly through German lines and then comes back, literally just a guy running back and forth across a war-torn street, becomes so much more effective and haunting and memorable than 3 full minutes of Spartan Cirque du Soleil. And we've all been listening to me talk for a while here, so I think we've earned the clip.
At first, the Germans didn't shoot at it. I think they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. But that wasn't the really astounding thing. The astounding thing was that after he hooked up with I Company, he came back.
In Dawn of Victory, we need to follow the Band of Brothers model. Excitement needs to be used sparingly and should always have consequences. We need to resist the temptation to fill every bit of lore with action or drama and embrace that sometimes life, even in a fictional universe, can be boring. Not only will this give us room to explore the ramifications of major events when they do occur, but I think it will give them a greater impact. Less is sometimes more. Now, all that said, I do want to quickly acknowledge that there is room for flexibility. In Dawn of Victory, most of the time we'll be aiming for what's most realistic and plausible, but sometimes the rule of cool can win, and it can win big. This is still just a world-building project, and it's perfectly fine to add some details or elements simply because they're the most interesting or unique or just plain rad. And sometimes these elements that aren't trying to be plausible can still be a major component of the universe. Space combat's an example of this. I'm not sure how it's going to work in DOV quite yet, but I'm definitely going to break away from reality a bit. But moving on to our next pillar, one of the tropes sometimes associated with the standard sci-fi setting is this idea that upon exploring the galaxy, mankind will begin to uncover some shocking mystery whose revelations challenge every preconceived notion about our place in the universe. Maybe it's related to some kind of cosmic ascension into another form of life, or the secret origin of humanity on Earth, or just the meaning of existence in general. There can be prophecies, destinies, and sometimes angels are involved, but in most cases, human beings are just special in some way, and they need to discover how they're a part of something bigger. In Dawn of Victory, this isn't the case. Humans aren't special, and space is just space. No more mystical or spiritual than any other frontier. It can provide meaning, comfort, and advance our understanding of the universe, but if you head out into the Orion Arm looking for some alien to explain the purpose of your existence to you, you're not going to find anything. The truth is not out there. But other stuff is. Just because humanity wasn't secretly guided by aliens or prophesized to transform itself into pure energy, doesn't mean Dawn of Victory is bereft of higher mysteries. I want the setting to be strange and chilling in places, to hint at forces that for now at least remain deep in the shadows. The Synfaxi are a big one, but maybe not the only one. Talking about this for too long would kind of defeat the point of keeping things mysterious, but as an example, I want to quickly discuss Achtung Cthulhu, or Hellboy, whatever you prefer. In both those settings, and plenty of others, you usually have the Axis trying to unlock some terrible Lovecraftian horror, while the Allies are trying to stop them. But this never really seemed entirely realistic to me, and not because of the cosmic space god aspect to it. Rather, it always seemed to me that if the Nazis were trying to wake up Cthulhu, the Allies wouldn't just work to stop them, but try to beat them to it. Am I saying there's Lovecraftian gods in DOV? No. But I do want to make the point that if they did exist, you'd have a very hard time convincing any of the superpowers not to go down that road. So take that small bit of information any way you like. Now, there's plenty of other pillars that are going to be foundational to Dawn of Victory, but this video is already pretty long, and we gotta draw the line somewhere. So let's end on the element of our setting that I'm maybe the most excited about, the world's greatest space map. If we were developing a fantasy world or something purely in the realm of alternate history, this would require no explanation. A good map is almost essential in these genres, and some, like Middle-earth or Westeros, have managed to ascend to a mythical place in popular culture. But when it comes to cartography, science fiction, and especially those variants of the Standard Sci Fi Setting, find themselves in a tougher place for one main reason.
Wow, the universe is so boring.
The unfortunate fact is, we don't call it space because it's so full of interesting stuff to look at. And as if that wasn't enough, it also happens to exist in 3 dimensions, which makes depicting it in map form extremely difficult. Space maps in science fiction consequently tend to be pretty boring, with even official releases from major properties like Star Wars or Star Trek underdeveloped and fairly mediocre. When we get to the episode of this series dedicated entirely to space maps, I'll have plenty more to say about this, possibly way too much, but until then, here's a small preview. Because of our focus on astropolitics, Dawn of Victory needs a good space map. It's not optional. If we say that in the event of total war, the goal of the Soviet Union is to rush its forces into the space Fulda Gap and occupy the Rhine star cluster in 5 star days, I want you to be able to look at that map and know exactly what that would entail. But it needs to go even further. Our star map also needs to delineate all the different regions of the Orion Arm and their strategic implications in a way that's meaningful and accessible. If I tell you you've been appointed the head of the Japanese Navy and been assigned the task of identifying which star systems in the Orinoco Spur are the most important to your long-term strategic goals in the region, you should be able to come up with that answer. Not because I told you what it is, but because you were able to apply some basic geopolitical theories to this star map and come up with your own conclusion. I really want you to be able to study this thing and get a real sense of the balance of power and the strategic situation. But this takes us back to our original problem. Space is mostly empty. It's all well and good to say that I want people poring over the star map for hours and hours, but if it's just a bunch of white dots connected by white lines on a black background with maybe some coordinates to give the illusion of 3D space, well, that approach might be accurate, but it's not exactly interesting to look at. And what I think a lot of people forget with regards to fictional maps, especially in science fiction, is that their purpose isn't just to tell you how to get from point A to B. They should immerse you in the universe, give you a sense of history, or convey tone and emotion. The best fantasy maps invite exploration and reverie, and I want Dawn of Victory's star map to accomplish this as well. If our setting was very much hard sci-fi, this might not be possible. But because we're a bit more towards the middle of that axis, when it comes to star maps, I'm okay sacrificing realism and the illusion of 3D space for visual appeal and immersion. I said that the rule of cool would occasionally win big. This is one of those times. The Orion Arm in Dawn of Victory should bear little resemblance to the Orion Arm of reality. There needs to be vibrant nebula, anomalies, and all manner of interstellar phenomena, yet with just enough of reality to make it all feel at least somewhat plausible. Homeworld is a great example of where this balance has been achieved really well. Mass Effect is another. You feel like you're in space, but it's always beautiful to look at. This is what we'll be aiming for in our star map. Of course, actually achieving all this is a different matter entirely. So before we launched this series and the prospect of needing a space map like this first arose, we reached out to Tim Barton. You may not recognize the name, but you've likely seen his work because we feature it in pretty much every video we've ever made covering Warhammer 40,000. The skyboxes he created for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 are some of the most beautiful ever made, and most recently, he worked on a little title called Baldur's Gate? I don't know, some D&D thing. You've probably never heard of it anyways, as it sounds pretty niche. The point is, the man knows his space artwork, and this is the guy we needed to talk to find out what was possible. And when we first announced this project, I said we'd be very open about the challenges we come up against. And as is so often the case, this is an example of where hopes clash with reality a bit. In discussing the project with Tim, It turns out the reason you don't see these hyper-detailed custom space maps from even major franchises is that the process of creating them would be a monumental effort. Earlier in the summer, we released a few teasers of what we hoped the space map in Dawn of Victory might look like. These were hand-painted, basically from scratch, in some areas literally pixel by pixel, and it took an immense amount of work. To achieve the same level of quality across the whole of the Orion Arm with, say, a dozen or more major regions and hundreds of smaller areas, all with little details scattered throughout, all painted by hand, would be an exponentially larger project than anything likely ever attempted. At the very least, it would take hundreds of hours of work spread out across years. So if you can excuse the metaphor, this is one of those moments where we have the ship, we have the captain, we want to deliver the goods, but to put it lightly, the waters are full of torpedoes.
I think that it can be said that it can never be doubted that the goods will be delivered by this nation whose Navy believes in the tradition of damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.
Okay, so we decided to do it anyways. I'm incredibly proud to announce that for the past few months, we've been working with Tim not just to create a single region of the Orion Arm or even 2 or 3, but the whole thing. We are still very early in the process and there is a lot left to do, but the results are already unbelievable. And when it's finished, we'll have something truly unprecedented and extraordinary. This is the kind of investment in both time and resources that any rational company would consider entirely insane, and it's only possible thanks to this community. Whether you're a member of our Patreon, a subscriber on YouTube, or just someone who watches the occasional video, you have my deepest gratitude. But this is just the first of a whole bunch of exciting announcements that I get to make today. But before we can get to them, I also want to acknowledge not just the personnel of the Templin Institute, but those of you who might have been aware of the Dawn of Victory setting well before we ever talked about it on this channel. As I mentioned during our initial pitch, the basic premise of this universe was originally developed over a decade ago now as a mod for Star Wars Empire at War and then Sins of a Solar Empire. The writing and world building I contributed to that project had its problems, and it's been cathartic to be able to revisit the concept and begin to reimagine it completely from scratch. Being a part of Dawn of Victory in that first incarnation was one of the highlights of my life. I got to work with amazing people, and I learned so much from it. But it could also be isolating and frustrating. Even when things are going well, modding can be a brutal, unforgiving hobby, and we made it extra difficult by holding ourselves to these insanely high standards. We were working ourselves to death, and at the time it felt like almost nobody cared about this little project. It put a real chip on our shoulders, I think, and after over a decade of trying to build an audience for it, it was really heartbreaking to have to shut it down. Everyone on that team poured so much of themselves into that project, but it had become a necessity to move on. For me, that meant the Templin Institute, and no complaints there, that worked out pretty well. But on March 29th, 2018, just a few months after the launch of this YouTube channel, we put out an episode covering the world building of Iron Harvest. And in the comments of that video, somebody said we should check out this setting called Dawn of Victory because they thought you might like it. At the time, it was just this little funny moment, but it kept happening. Over the following months and years, we would consistently get comments from people telling us to make a video on this old Sins mod. During meetings, people we were talking to would bring it up, completely unaware that I had worked on this project. Having previously felt like we had really failed to make an impact, this was wild and meant a lot to me. We started working on that mod in 2006, and now, over 67 years later, references to it are still showing up in all these weird places. There is even a Dawn of Victory revitalization committee that's active on Reddit and Discord, while some very talented people on DeviantArt are still producing fan designs. If we had Martecki on the team back in 2006, we might have actually finished the mod. So thank you guys, consider Dawn of Victory revitalized. And I mention this not only because I'm very grateful to these people for keeping the flame burning, but because I think it proves an important point I'm trying to make with this whole series. World building is this fun, creative exercise, but the barrier to entry can sometimes feel kind of intimidating. That if you want to do it properly, you need years of formal training as a writer or millions of dollars to have your project developed professionally. But if Dawn of Victory, a failed modding project developed by a small group of nerds in between midnight sessions of CNC Generals and Battlefield 2 is still being talked about, I think that's gotta be pretty encouraging to anyone who has ever thought about making their own setting. I think we're in an exciting time. There's a real appetite out there for original ideas, and projects like the Mystery Flesh Pit National Park, Monster Garden, and even things like the Backrooms prove it's become easier than ever to find and build an audience. So, whether you joined the Dawn of Victory community back in the early days of Slipstream Productions, or 20 seconds ago because hearing tales of the hardship we endured guilted you into it, thank you for taking the chance on something new. Alright, now on to the fun stuff. You listened to me talk for 50 minutes? Oh my god. Okay, well you stuck it out, or just skip to this part, so now I can make some big announcements. As I mentioned at the top, the Dawn of Victory project has officially started. We're rolling. In the description below, you'll find a link to our secondary YouTube channel, where we'll be developing the lore for this universe, and that first bit of lore is already live, the story of Firebase Hector, the American outpost in the center of the Three Cities campaign, and the 99-day siege that shattered the myth of American superiority is available right now on the dedicated DOV YouTube channel. And we are enormously proud to once again be working with the Templin Institute's favorite artist in residence, Joan Pique Llorens. After doing such an awesome job with Stellaris Invicta Season 2, it's amazing to be working with him again on the visual development of Dawn of Victory. Firebase Hector is just the first piece of the Orion arm Joan has brought to life, and there'll be plenty more concept art on the way. Also, in the description are links to a new dedicated Discord server for this project, and some social accounts we've set up. But wait, there's more! To bring you the latest news and updates from the Orion arm, the Templin Institute is participating in our first interdimensional partnership with the Champlain Group. Now, I don't have to tell you that the Champlain Group is one of the finest open source intelligence companies operating in the local cluster, or the Sea of Clouds for that matter. Their work, published in 2281, analyzing Republican orbital defenses during the First Vega War, was astonishing in its insights, and we look forward to years of similar content. Through the Champlain Group, which as you may have picked up on, will serve as a bit of a framing device, we have opened a wiki where all the details from the Dawn of Victory setting will slowly be added. We're hosting this wiki ourselves, so if you're a big fan of articles being interrupted by unrelated video content and every page being flooded by ads, I'm sorry, but you're out of luck. Right now it's kinda barren, but you can already find a whole ton of additional details expanding on Firebase Hector and the events surrounding it. We'll be adding more articles for each new episode we put out, so it won't be long before the wiki really starts to come together. Plus, on the Templin Institute commissary, we've added a new section for Dawn of Victory. This is one of the main ways we'll be funding the series, so if you want to help support the effort and get some merchandise in the process, you'll find that link in the description as well. Right now, we have that concept art of Firebase Hector available, but also some of the older artwork we commissioned back in the modding days. This older stuff, let's call it Dawn of Victory Legends, no, Dawn of Victory Classic, might not totally reflect the new canon we're developing, but if you want to grab it anyways and support the project, use the offer code Iron Curtain and get yourself a 15% discount. And remember the world's greatest space map we're developing? That's not just going to sit on a hard drive somewhere, it's online. We have developed a basic interactive map letting you explore the Orion arm at your leisure, at least some of it. Right now, only 2 major interstellar regions have been revealed, and just like the wiki, as the project progresses, we'll be showing off more and more of it. But you will note, there are no star systems on this map, no hyperspace lanes, or here be dragons, or anything. This is partly because Tim's work is just so beautiful, I think it speaks for itself. But it's mostly because we still gotta add all that stuff. And this leads me to my last, possibly most exciting announcement. When announcing this series, I said I wanted to have our setting be developed in the open, and that wasn't some drunken boast. Today, January 6th at 2 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, I'm going to start designing the Dawn of Victory map, live streamed right here on YouTube. But for now, head onto the primary flight deck and talk to any yellow shirt. They'll be able to direct you to the next dropship making its way down to Firebase Hector, and for God's sakes, get down there as fast as you can. If we don't get some more bodies on the line, that whole place is going up. Just make sure that you do make it back alive in time for our stream. And as always, good luck and good world building.